Introducing 100 Days of Code with Treehouse. What is 100 Days of Code? It's a long-standing coding challenge created by Alex Callaway, and it's simple. Commit to learning every day for 100 days. The amount that you learn in that short time frame will change your life. Whether you want to level up your skills or jumpstart a new career, commit to the challenge. You'll be shocked by how much you learn and accomplish. You'll have the full support of the Treehouse community of students working with you. We'll be sending you motivational emails, clips from our 100 Days of Code podcast, featuring advice, tips and tricks from developers, and so much more. There's never been a better time to commit to your learning. Join us.
All right. Well, hello again, everyone. I am Guil Hernandez. I'm a software development instructor at Treehouse. That's teamtreehouse.com, where I teach full stack JavaScript development and front-end web development. And today we're going to have a little fun diving into some React and how to work with React hooks specifically. So at Treehouse, we do have entire tracks with courses and workshops that teach you React, starting from the very beginning all the way to building full stack JavaScript applications with React, and also using one of the latest features introduced to the library, which is hooks. So this live stream assumes that you know the basics of React, and if you haven't worked with React yet and you just want to hang out for 30 minutes to check out how hooks work, that's okay too. Welcome all. Now, if you do want to download the files for the project that I'm going to be working on, you can find the link to a repository posted in the chat. We also have a Treehouse staff moderating the chat, so if you have questions about anything covered in this live stream or about Treehouse in general, feel free to ask away. All right, so a little bit about React. So React, in a nutshell, it's a JavaScript library for building user interfaces, and it provides really a more efficient and flexible way of building, organizing, and maintaining all of your UI code, as well as the state of the application, right? That's any data that you want to track in the app. And it lets you do that by way of components, a component being a piece of UI that you can reuse. Now, for example, with JavaScript, you're able to reuse code with functions, right? Well, a component lets you reuse code through functions and classes, which we'll talk about more in a little bit. And you reuse code that renders a part of your UI, and it uses a special syntax called JSX, which looks a lot like HTML. So you can create a component with a regular JavaScript function or a class, as I mentioned. And class components specifically, they can do a whole lot of different things, right? They provide one way to declare and manage state. You can also run certain code based on the lifecycle of a component with lifecycle methods, right? You can fetch data from an API, for example, then render something with that data. Or classes can also render other components and pass data down to them. Now, class components until recently provided the only way you were able to declare state and access lifecycle methods. And they were often called stateful components, right? And there's also components that don't do a whole lot either, right? All they do is render UI, maybe a button, navigation, or header. And these are regular functions, right? Regular function components and not classes, typically. Now, until recently, these function components were referred to as stateless components because you really weren't able to declare and set state and access lifecycle methods within them. But not anymore, right? That's where React hooks comes in. So React hooks, which were introduced back in React 16.8, they give you a whole lot of flexibility, right? And mainly they give you ways to declare and manage state and use lifecycle methods and other features of React within function components. Now, a hook itself, it's the special built-in function that allow you to hook in to the power of class components, and really provides a cleaner, more straightforward syntax when it's all said and done. So I'm going to go over how to use 3 of React's standard built-in hooks, some common ones, right? So one of them is useState, then useEffect, and useContext. So I'll cover the basics of these hooks. And then we'll use them to refactor parts of a React application that uses class components for certain things. And then I'll convert them from stateful class components to stateful function components, that one of which fetches data and updates the component with this alternative to a lifecycle method, the useEffect hook. And then we'll at the end get into accessing the application's context with a hook. So lots of stuff. So this is the simple application we're going to get into. Again, you can grab the link from for the repo holding the files for this, both the start and final files in the chat. And so it's fetching 9 random dog images from the awesome dog API. And then it's rendering for each these card-like components, and each also has a star rating component that lets you rate the dog, and it also displays the rating above the star. Now, who are we kidding? If we're talking dog rating, they're all going to get 5s, right? But yeah, so this is really the gist of it. Nothing too fancy. So again, a hook, right? Think of it as a function that when you call it, it lets you hook into React state and lifecycle features from within a function component. And really the most useful built-in hook is called useState. And what it allows you to do is basically what the name implies. You can use React state in a function component. Now, most recently, in many cases, the only way to create a stateful class component was with a constructor that assigns the initial this.state like this. And then, to update the state, you would need to call, sorry if it's small, but down here you would need to call, for example, this.setState. Well, because you use hooks inside functions only, they don't work inside classes. This, for example, is not available inside a function component. So, instead, you use the useState hook for state management. Now here, for example, once you import useState from React, the next step is to declare your state variable by calling useState. So you can think of useState as working as the equivalent of both this.state and this.setState for function components. And as you can see here, it accepts one argument. It's optional. And what that is, it's the initial value of state. So here, the initial value of the score state is 0, for example. So when you call useState in a function with the initial state, it's going to return an array. And the array holds 2 values. The first element in the array is the current state, right? It's a variable representing the current state, which is 0 in this case. And the second item or element in the array is a function that you use to update the value in state. And it's really similar to this.setState. So here it's called setScore. And when you work with hooks, it's really common to use destructuring assignment syntax to assign each return value, the value useState returns, to distinct variables. So here, for example, the array on the left of the equal sign stores the values useState returns and assigns each value to the variable names score and setScore, respectively. And yeah, as I mentioned, the variable score now holds the current state, and you can use that value in your component as you would any variable. For example, here in the return statement, it's displaying the score in between those h1 tags, right, to render it. So normally, useState, when you're working with classes, a state always has to be an object for the most part, right? It always does. State is an object. But with useState, state can be an object, it can be an array, it can be another JavaScript primitive, maybe a string or integer. So it's super flexible in that way. Now, to update what what's in state, right? Instead of calling this dot set state like you would in a class, you use that updater function, set score in this case, and that second value returned by useState. So here that updater function is assigned to set score, and it's updating the score state of this app function component. You just pass it the new state. So here we're calling set score, and we're saying score +1, for example, to increment the score when you click a button. That's it. Cool. So let's see this in action. Again, we're gonna work on this app here. So I'll bring up VS Code. This is my project, and let's start with the dog component here in components dog.js. And this is currently a stateful class component, right? It declares a rating state that's initially set to 0. And there's this handler function here that updates the rating state, right? So it sets the rating according to the star that you click. So if state is set, then you click the same star again, it resets it to 0, right? So that's this right here. Otherwise, it sets it to the new rating, right? Now, in the render method down here, we have an image that gets rendered, and that renders the dog image from the data passed down to it from its parent app component. We're also displaying the rating set by us, the user, and then it renders that star rating component, displaying all the stars here, which is an SVG. Now, star rating and the star component, they're stateless function components, so we're not going to worry too much about those here. Cool. So in this dog component, the first thing we'll do, since we're going to convert it from a class to a function, a stateful function. So up here, I'm going to import the useState hook from React. And let's turn this into a function here. So get rid of this class, say function, dog. Remove the render method. And again, you can't use this. I'll get rid of the constructor as well. Let's set this to the variable. Let's get rid of this .set state because we can't use that in a function. Again, I'll get rid of all the references to this here in the return. And okay, so we'll leave that there for now. Cool. So what I'll do now is use my hook, right? So let's set it up here at the top of the function definition. We're going to call useState, and this is the rating state. So we'll set it to 0 initially, and I'll sort of unpack that from what useState returns. So in here, instead of saying state.rating, for example, we can just say rating. That's this right here. And let's see, props.url. I'll go ahead and destructure the URL here from props in the function definition. Okay, so we have that. Now, let's define that state updater function I talked about, right? So we're going to set the rating. So we'll call it set rating. And then we'll change this here to if the new rating is the same as the rating. So we're going to get rid of this .state rating. It's just going to be rating. We're going to update the state here by calling that set rating function, and we'll set it to 0. There's probably different ways you can do this, but this is really one of the most straightforward ways for teaching this. So otherwise, we'll set it to the new rating, right? Whatever star the user clicks next. And I think that's it. Let me check the console. Okay, cool. So everything should work the same. Yep, rating 4, 5. Good. Cool. So now we have a stateful function component that works just as it did when it was a stateful class, right? Using the useState hook. All right, now that that's in place, let's move on up to this the main app component, which is currently a stateful class component. It declares a data state. It's initially set to an array. And what this component does is it fetches the dog data from the API and updates that data here, the data state, with an array of URLs, right, that point to the random dog images. So for this, we're going to use the useState hook to declare and manage the data states. So we're going to use a special hook for this called useEffect to fetch the dog URL. So real quick, let's talk a little bit about side effects and life cycles and components, right? So there are different phases. If you work with React frequently, you'll know that component has different phases, right, and different life cycles, if you will. So the mounting, updating, and unmounting. And React provides these lifecycle methods that lets you run code at specific moments of the life cycle. So for example, you can re-render a component, update the DOM when data changes. You can fetch data from an API, maybe perform any cleanups that are necessary if you're removing a component or after subscribing to something, that kind of thing. So these types of actions are usually referred to as side effects because you can't perform them during rendering usually, right? Additional code needs to run after React updates the DOM. So if you're, again, if you've worked with React a lot, you may have used some of the common ones, which are component did mount, component did update, and component will unmount. So here, for example, in the app component, we are using component did mount, right, to fetch data from the dog API. Then we're using the fetch method, the fetch API, in a series of promises. So React provides this useEffect hook to let you perform side effects in function components and have access to common lifecycle hooks, right? So if you're familiar, again, with lifecycle methods, you can think of useEffect as working like component did mount, component did update, and component will unmount combined, right? All from one function call. All right, so let's do a little refactoring. Let's refactor this app component to a function that calls useEffect. So let's see, back here in our code, the first thing I'll do is I'll import, so we're going to declare state, and then we're going to use, we're going to do some data fetching. So I'll need to import useState as well as the useEffect hook. And like earlier, I'll convert this from a class to a function. Let's get rid of the constructor. Let me get rid of this lifecycle method here, but what I'll do is I'll comment the fetch method. Oops. Comment the fetch method. Let's get rid of the render method here. We'll say, so we're going to declare a data state soon, so we don't need this state, remember, so we'll just leave it as data.map. It's going to map over the data returned from the API and render out this dog component with the image. Cool, so I think that's looking good. All right, so you'll most likely use that hook, useEffect hook, that's what it's called. You'll most likely use it to fetch data from an API, and a lot like you would using component did mount, like you saw here. So let's first declare that data state that used to be in the constructor. So we'll say const data. Let's also declare this state updater function. I'll call it setData. And I'll assign that useState call. And the data is going to come in as an array, so I'll set it to an empty array initially. That looks good. So again, data.map means this. All right, let's use our useEffect hook now. So I'm going to do it here, just above the return. And useEffect, it takes a callback function as its first argument. So let's do that. Cool. So inside this callback is where really you perform all your side effects. So here is where I will fetch the data. So I'll move this. Oops, sorry. I will move the promise sequence that's fetching my data inside the useEffect hook. Cool. So one last thing, right? So remember here we're updating the data state here with this .set state. Well, that doesn't work inside functions, right? So we can actually get rid of all that. And what do? Well, we call set data, right? Because that's the name of our updater function here. So that's all we have to do there. And update it with the data coming in from the API, which is this message property from that the dog API returns. I think that's it. Hopefully no errors. Well, a couple of things. So if everything works as expected, you'll notice, you'll notice that something's happening here. Look at all the flashes of dog images. So it's fetching data from the API, and it's making a call over and over again and re-rendering the components. So what useEffects does is it instructs React to do something after render. So it's called when the component first renders, then after each subsequent re-render or on a state update. So in this case, the effect is running again and again, and it keeps sort of re-updating that data state, which is causing the re-render. So if you want to run an effect only once, which is what we want to do here, right? We just want to run the call to fetch and display the dogs on the initial render. What you can do here is pass useEffect an empty array as the second argument here. So that's what I'm doing here. And what this does is it tells React that, okay, this effect doesn't depend on any values for props or state. I don't need to pay attention to any of that in order to re-render because I'm just fetching data once. So it's saying, hey, this never needs to rerun. Just load it up on initial render and that's it, right? So what that does is it prevents any unnecessary renders. So with that in place, so we don't get the those re-renders. So it just renders once. And good. Awesome. All right. Now, if you did have any, for example, any state variables that required a re-render after update, say you were, changing a message or something else, some other side effect that was dependent on a state variable, for example, then you list it here inside the array. For example, you might do that or like message, but in this case, everything's working as expected. And also React, if you do have a missing dependency here in useEffect, React's going to throw a warning in the console for you. So it's going to let you know, hey, there's some missing dependencies. You might want to check that out. So in this case, there are none. Cool. So that's the basics of useEffect. And if you have any questions, bring them on. Again, love talking about hooks and React in general. All right, so almost done here. So let's have a look at one more thing. So the useContext hook, right? So React has this thing called the Context API, right? And it's apart from hooks, but if you worked with it before, you'll know that it gives you a way to pass data to components without having to pass props manually at every single level, which is known as prop drilling. And you use context really when certain data needs to be accessible to several components at all different nesting levels. So this useContext hook provides the functionality of the context API in a single function. So once you've created your app's context, you can call the useContext hook inside a function, and you can access any state and actions that are in your context. Super handy. So for now, I'll just share the date state via context and do the data fetching there, just so you can see how it works. So we'll keep it simple. Cool. Let's see. So I had a question here. So the final variables passed into useEffect in that final array are the things the function watches for changes. Yes, it is. And again, React will let you know. It's like, hey, there's something changing here. You might want to list it as a dependency. Otherwise, things aren't going to work as expected. Good question. All right, so let's do this. So I'll close this. So I have this context folder here already defined in an empty index file. And this is where I'm going to define my context. Most of this is not going to be hook specific. Again, you'll see familiar things here like useState and useEffect. So let's get started on that. So here, let's create a blank component. We'll import a few things. Again, useState and useEffect from React. And so I'm going to define my context here. So I'll export it via the variable. Let's call it dog rating context. That sounds good to me. And I'm going to do react.createContext. This is against a method call specific to the context API, which we have a workshop at Treehouse for this. Kind of like a hook, but for context. Okay, so we have that. So now I'm going to export my provider, right? That's the thing that provides the context. So let's do a function called provider. And be a simple function here. So let's do a few things. All right. So in the function, I'm going to move over. Remember, so I don't need this here anymore in the main app component because I'm moving it over to context. So I'm going to copy over this call to useState with the data state and the set data updater. I'm going to move it inside this provider function component as well as my useEffect hook. So this really simplifies the app component. It's really just a few lines of code now. And I'm going to paste that in here, the data fetching. All right, so now let's return the provider. So again, we'll say dog rating context dot provider. And since this is a higher order component, so I'm going to do props.children to render any sort of child component that the provider wraps. And yeah, the provider takes this value prop here, and anything that you want to pass down through context goes inside this object. In this case, we only have one thing, which is this data state, right? So I'm specifying that here as a value prop. And I think that's looking good. We'll see if React throws any errors. So one more thing. The main index file here, the entry point, I'm going to wrap the entire app in our new provider, as you normally would when working with the context API and these higher order provider components. So up here, let's do, I name the component provider. So importing that here. Context. And that looks good. So I'll wrap this main app component here in provider. Oops. All right, let's see what's going on here. Data is not defined. Oh, yeah. So we got to call context, right? We got to use the hook. Okay, so this is looking good. And all right, so back in the app component here, we just saw the provider is the top level component. So let's go back and access the data in the app component from context. So here in app.js, I'll need to import a new hook, useContext. And I also need to import this context that I've defined, which is called dog rating context. So I'll do that at the top of the file here. And then inside the function, I'm going to call useContext. And what it does is it accepts a context object as the argument. So I'm going to pass this hook the app's context, which is dog rating context. And what it does is it returns an object holding the current context. And currently it's only data. So I'm going to unpack the data state from that context object. So use a little destructuring here and specify data here. All right. And yeah, I think that's it. Hopefully it's working. Yep. That is indeed it. So we got our rating displaying here. All our dogs are rendering. Check out React Dev Tools here. You can see the state here. We have all our URLs in state. And everything's working as expected. Cool. So yeah, before hooks, for example, you had to set up your high order provider component holding your app state and actions as a class. You also had to import and use a consumer inside any component that needed access to the provider. And use things like render props, which adds a little more syntax and can get a little messy. But yeah, useContext makes it really a whole lot easier, as you can see here. It provides the functionality of context API in a single function, and you don't need any of those in-between consumer components. So awesome. All right, and it looks like everything is looks like everything works great, just as it did when we started. So if you have any questions, yeah, go ahead and let our moderator know. But hopefully, you've learned a little bit more about how hooks really saves you from having to write more code than you have to, and it makes your components cleaner, readable, and often, hopefully, less susceptible to errors, right? Because you're just working with regular functions. Now, there's other hooks I didn't mention. For example, use reducer. There's also one like use ref, which I really like. It really provides an easier way to sort of access the value of an input field like you would using the ref attribute, but it's way more powerful. And yeah, as you can see here, you're able to use hooks starting in React 16.8. And the cool thing is that they're completely opt-in. You don't have to refactor your entire app to use hooks. You can use them gradually in your project and alongside other code, as you get more comfortable with hooks and where you see fit. And I really suggest checking out this rules of hooks section of the React docs too. It's react.js.org doc/hook rules.html. You can link to it from the sidebar here. And it talks about all the rules that you might want to follow when using hooks. And it talks about this handy linter plugin that's built in to create React app that helps you enforce these rules automatically. And yeah, a whole lot more explanation in the docs about hooks, even writing custom hooks, which you can do, and more here in the docs. And there's also some of that in our React Hooks workshop on Treehouse, so check that out. What would be another use case for useContext? That's a question that just came in. Yeah, good question. So I've most recently started using it for exactly what I showed you here. So if any of you folks have other use cases for it, totally feel free to post it in the chat. I'll be happy to learn more use cases as well. But yeah, I mainly use it for accessing my context for my provider, which is super handy. It's like direct access to it from a function. Yeah, other than that, that's all I have for you today. So again, hope you enjoyed learning the wonders of hooks. You can learn a whole lot more about full stack JavaScript topics, front-end web development topics at teamtreehouse.com. Check out the free trial we always have going on there. I'm Guil H on the Twitters if you want to follow me there. And yeah, thanks so much for tuning in. Happy coding, everyone. Bye.